What if everything you believed your future would be slowly started slipping away? What if the place you once called home, the dream you thought you were building, suddenly became something you no longer recognized? For years, audiences around the world watched one family open their lives in a way that felt rare, honest, and deeply human. Through laughter, challenges, and unforgettable milestones, the Roloffs became more than just reality TV stars. They became a symbol of resilience, of love, of what it means to build something that lasts. We watched them grow. We watched them struggle. And we believed in the future they were creating, together. But behind the smiles, behind the success, another story was quietly unfolding. A story of shifting relationships, of expectations that no longer aligned, of dreams that began to change little by little until nothing felt certain anymore. Because sometimes, the hardest part isn't building something from the ground up. It's realizing that what you built may not hold the way you hoped it would. From creating a legacy that inspired millions, to facing moments that would test their bond like never before. This isn't just a story about a family. It's a story about change, about conflict, about what happens when life takes a direction no one saw coming, and how even the strongest foundations. At the heart of this story is a family that stood out, not because they were trying to be different, but because their everyday lives naturally challenged what many people believed was normal. Long before the cameras ever showed up, before the interviews, the episodes, the recognition, there was just a family trying to build a life on their own terms. Living with dwarfism brought challenges that most people never have to think about. Simple, everyday tasks, reaching a shelf, navigating public spaces, even moving comfortably through a world not designed for them, required constant adaptation. And beyond the physical challenges, there were the social ones. The stares, the assumptions, the quiet judgments from people who didn't understand. But instead of shrinking under that pressure, the Roloffs did something different. They leaned into it. They didn't try to hide who they were. They built their lives around it. They found ways to adapt, to problem solve, and to push forward in a world that didn't always make space for them. And that resilience didn't come from one moment. It was built over years. Before television ever became part of their story, there were real struggles happening behind the scenes. Financial uncertainty, the pressure of raising a family, the responsibility of maintaining a property that would eventually become central to everything. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And in the middle of all of it, something else was taking shape. A vision. The farm wasn't just land, it was an idea. A place where their family could grow, where their children could learn responsibility, independence, and creativity. A place that felt like theirs in a world that often didn't. That sense of purpose became the glue that held everything together. Because no matter what challenges came their way, there was always something they were working toward. Then everything changed. When Little People, Big World first aired, it didn't feel like just another reality show. It felt different. At a time when representation like this was rare, viewers were suddenly given a window into a world they had never truly seen before, not through headlines or stereotypes, but through everyday life. And what they found wasn't just eye-opening. It was human. They saw laughter around the dinner table. They saw disagreements, frustrations, and growing pains. They saw parents trying to guide their kids, and kids trying to figure out who they were. Yes, the family was different. But at the same time, they were. Because underneath everything, the cameras, the challenges, the uniqueness, this was a story people recognized. A story about building something from nothing. About holding on to each other through uncertainty. About trying, failing, and trying again. It was about being a family. And for a while, it felt like that foundation was unshakable. But what no one could see yet was how the very thing that brought them together would eventually start to pull them apart. As the years passed, What started as a simple piece of land slowly transformed into something much bigger, something that reflected not just hard work, but identity. Roloff Farms wasn't built overnight. It took years of vision, trial and error, and relentless effort from Matt Roloff and Amy Roloff. What they created wasn't just a working farm, it became a destination. A place where imagination turned into reality, especially during pumpkin season, when families from all over would come to experience something that felt almost magical. There were castles, pirate ships, and handcrafted attractions, each one telling a story of creativity and persistence. But behind all of it was something deeper, a shared purpose. This wasn't just about building a business. It was about building something the entire family could be part of. For the kids, Zach Roloff, Jeremy Roloff, Molly Roloff, and Jacob Roloff, the farm became more than just home. It was where they learned responsibility, teamwork, and what it meant to contribute to something larger than themselves. Whether it was helping during the busy pumpkin seasons or taking part in new projects, their childhood was tied directly to the growth of the farm. And as the farm grew, so did the belief that it would one day be theirs to carry forward. It wasn't always said outright, but it was felt, in the way responsibilities were shared, in the way decisions sometimes included the next generation, in the way the future seemed to quietly point in one direction. For a long time, it felt like the story had already been written. That one day, the farm would no longer just belong to Matt Roloff and Amy Roloff. It would belong to the family as a whole. A legacy passed down, not just through ownership but through meaning. But certainty can be fragile. And sometimes, the path that seems so clear in the beginning slowly begins to shift in ways no one expects. But the changes didn't happen all at once. They crept in quietly, through everyday decisions, through offhand comments, through moments that might have seemed insignificant at the time. As the kids stepped further into adulthood, independence became a bigger part of the equation. They weren't just part of the family anymore. They were individuals trying to carve out their own paths. And that's where things started to get complicated. Because while some still felt deeply connected to the farm, others began to question what their future really looked like within it. Was this something they were meant to inherit? Or something they were expected to be part of, without ever truly owning? Those questions didn't always get clear answers. And over time, uncertainty has a way of turning into frustration. What made it even harder was that this wasn't just a business, it was personal. Every disagreement carried emotional weight. Every decision felt like it meant something more than what was being said out loud. Different communication styles only added to the tension. Some were direct, others held things in, and when expectations aren't openly discussed, it leaves space for assumptions to grow. Assumptions about fairness, about commitment, about what was promised versus what was actually being offered. And those assumptions, they don't just disappear. They build. Behind the scenes, what once felt like a strong, united front was slowly becoming more fragile. Not broken, but strained. Still, from the outside looking in, much of it wasn't obvious. The traditions continued, the farm still operated, the family still showed up together. But underneath it all, something had changed. The foundation was no longer as steady as it once seemed. And as time went on, those small cracks, they were getting harder to ignore. Then came a turning point that no one could ignore, one that didn't just shift the story, but redefined it entirely. After years of building a life together, Matt and Amy made the difficult decision to separate and eventually divorce. For viewers who had watched their journey from the very beginning, it felt like the end of something foundational. The partnership that once held everything together was now coming apart. But for the family, this wasn't just emotional. It was deeply personal, complicated, and unavoidable. The place that had always symbolized unity, home, suddenly felt different. Routines changed. Holidays looked unfamiliar. Even simple traditions carried a new kind of weight. What once felt effortless now required intention, compromise, and sometimes distance. And while both Matt and Amy began moving forward in their own ways, finding new paths, and eventually new relationships, those changes didn't happen in isolation. They rippled outward, through the children, through the farm, through every shared memory that now had to be redefined. New relationships introduced new perspectives, but also new challenges. Adjustments weren't optional anymore, they were necessary. Everyone had to find their place again in a version of the family that no longer looked the way it once did. And maybe that was the hardest part. Because nothing was completely lost, but nothing was exactly the same either. What once felt like one unbreakable unit slowly evolved into something more layered, more complex. Still a family. Still connected. Just different. As the family adjusted to a new normal, another question began to quietly take center stage. What would happen to the farm? For years, it had been more than just land. It was the heart of everything, the place where memories were made, traditions were built, and a legacy seemed to be taking shape with each passing season. And for a long time, there was an unspoken understanding that one day that legacy would be passed down. But as time moved forward, that future became less certain. Conversations that once felt hypothetical started to carry real weight. Expectations, some spoken, many not, began to surface. And what had once felt like a shared vision slowly turned into something far more complicated. Because when family and business intersect, emotions don't stay neatly contained. They spill over. Disagreements emerged, not always loudly, but enough to create distance. Different perspectives on what was fair, what was realistic, and what was deserved began to clash. And perhaps the most difficult part wasn't just the outcome. It was the feeling behind it. The sense that what had been imagined for years might not come to pass the way everyone believed it would. For some, it felt like a missed opportunity. For others, a necessary decision. But for everyone involved, it marked a shift. The farm was still there. The legacy still existed. But the idea of what that legacy meant and who it belonged to was no longer clear. And in that uncertainty, something deeper was revealed. Because this was never just about property. It was about communication. About expectations left unspoken. About how differently people can see the same future, even when they started from the same place. In the end, the story of the farm didn't just shape the family's future. It reshaped their relationships. For years, the farm wasn't just land, it was a promise. A promise that lived quietly in conversations, in long days of work, in the belief that everything being built would one day stay within the family. It wasn't always said out loud. It didn't have to be. It was understood, or at least, it felt that way. But when the moment finally arrived, when that idea had to become something real, it stopped being a dream and started becoming a decision. And decisions are rarely simple. What had once been emotional suddenly became practical. Numbers entered the conversation. So did ownership, responsibility, and the true weight of what the farm was actually worth, not just financially, but personally. Because value means different things to different people. To one side, the farm represented years of sacrifice, risk, and investment, a lifetime of building something from nothing. To the other, it represented a future, a continuation, a chance to carry forward something that had always felt like it belonged to them, too. And somewhere in between those perspectives, things began to fracture. Conversations stretched longer. Agreements became harder to reach. What once felt aligned started to pull in different directions. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about expectations. About whether those expectations had ever truly been shared, or simply assumed. For some, the outcome felt like the closing of a door they had been walking toward their entire lives. For others, it felt like making a necessary, if painful, choice in order to move forward. And that's the part that's hardest to sit with. There wasn't a clear villain in this story. Just people, standing on different sides of the same dream, trying to hold on to what mattered most to them. But even when no one is entirely wrong, it doesn't mean things don't break. Because sometimes, the biggest shifts don't come from a single moment. They come from the slow realization that what you thought was guaranteed was never fully yours to begin with. And in the end, the farm still stood. But the meaning behind it, the future it once seemed to promise, was no longer the same. In the end, the story of the Roloffs was never just about a farm. It wasn't just about a television show or a single disagreement that changed everything. It was about people, about a family that built something meaningful together, only to discover that growing up sometimes means growing apart. That time doesn't just move forward, it reshapes everything in its path. Because expectations, whether spoken or silently carried, have a way of becoming part of who we are. And when those expectations are fulfilled, they can feel like legacy. But when they're not, they can leave behind questions that don't have easy answers. What once felt certain doesn't always stay that way. And behind every moment that seemed picture perfect on screen, there were layers the world never fully saw. Decisions that weren't simple, conversations that didn't always resolve, and emotions that couldn't be neatly edited into a single episode. Because the truth is, no matter how strong something appears from the outside, real life is always more complicated. And sometimes, the most powerful part of a story isn't what was built, but what changed along the way. What lasted, what didn't, and what it all meant in the end. Thanks for watching. And until next time,